Hello everybody, and welcome to the final part of the conspiracy theory iceberg. We're finally here at the last curtain call, and I'm wearing the hoodie that I wore over a year ago now to start the first part of this series. And to be honest, I could never imagine that everything that's happened between then and now would come to be. And I'm so blessed, and I'll get all sappy about it at the end, but I just want to say thank you for being here, and thank you for sticking with me this long. Now, I'm sure that you're excited to get into these theories as much as I am, and let me tell you off the bat, they are a doozy. One thing that I want to mention now that I didn't really emphasize enough throughout the rest of this iceberg is that this list isn't strictly conspiracy theories, but you've probably figured that out at this point. The original name of this iceberg, whenever it was floating around on the internet a few years ago, was the Chart of Truth. So it's not just conspiracy theories in the way that we think of them, it's fundamental truths or hidden truths about reality. The reason I say that now is because pretty much every single entry, spare a few, on this final tier all have to do with theories about reality and God and existence and stuff like that. I will also add that a lot of these theories are the most philosophical within the entire iceberg, so if there was ever a time to do your own research where I could be wrong, this would be it. I also want to say, I'm not sure when this video is going to go up, but I am recording this on Christmas Eve, so let me say first and foremost, Merry Christmas. And I am so pumped and excited to get into this, and now I can finally say we've been from the tip of the iceberg all the way to the depths of it. So let's get into some of the weirdest concepts that I've ever read about. But before we get into that, you may be wondering why I've had a change of venue, and that's because of today's sponsor, Galaxy Lamps. And Galaxy Lamps is such a fantastic product that as soon as it came in, my girlfriend stole it from me and made me come to her place to shoot this ad, so now she gets to be the one to tell you about it. So before we turn this on, Kayla, how does the stand work? Take it out from under your shirt.
It has a 3-position stand, so you can control if it goes on the wall or on the ceiling.
As you can see, the Galaxy Lamp is a fantastic projector that can cast beautiful images onto the wall or ceiling of your choice.
And you can control it on your phone.
Not only does the Galaxy Lamp have 6 different settings and cool color options, but you can also do all of the controlling from your phone. And also, thanks to the horrors of modern technology,
Alexa, Galaxy Lamp on.
Stand by. Ta-da!
Oh, there's the stars.
Yes, there's the stars. Or if you like me and hate technology in general, there's a big button on the side that you can just manually press like this and flip through the different color and laser light options. And thanks to the app as well, you're able to set timers, different times for the lamp to turn on or shut off, as well as rotate and whatever else you like. And thanks to Galaxy Lamps, you can get in on this offer today if you go to the link in the description at galaxylamps.co/Wendigoon to get your order for 15% off. That's galaxylamps.co/Wendigoon for 15% off. Link in the description. Thank you so much to Galaxy Lamps for sponsoring the video. Thank you all so much for watching. It really does mean the most. I hope that you enjoy. Check them out. Link in the description. And we are back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Bank of Souls is a concept that originated from Jewish mysticism, however, it's been adapted into several other religious theories as well. According to the legend of the Bank of Souls, there is a finite amount of souls that can ever exist within human history. Specifically, this pool of souls is known as the Chamber of Guff and exists at the base of the Tree of Life. According to this legend, the Tree of Life bears fruit, and that fruit is actual human souls. Whenever a child is conceived, Gabriel reaches goes into the chamber, which is around the base of the tree where the fruit has fallen, he draws out a random soul, and that is passed into the new human that was just created. However, this tree has seasons of plenty and seasons of famine. In other words, there are some times when there are more people in the world than the tree can provide. According to the theory around the Bank of Souls, if someone is born or conceived at the time that there's not a soul for it, it will simply be born as a person without a soul. This is especially true in the modern age when population is at the highest that it's ever been and the tree cannot sustain the amount of people being born. These soulless people, or NPCs as the internet so delicately puts it, exist on Earth along with people who do have souls, and as a matter of fact, in some cases are used specifically to test those who do have souls to judge their worth. In other words, according to the theory, there are some people who exist and simply do not have control of their own actions, so they are purposefully made as a means to judge those who can be judged. You can follow that theory further and say that the reason you're so used to seeing people who have what is to you completely mind-numbing opinions and are constantly at opposition with you is a deliberate choice from whoever is controlling the system as a means to see how you deal with opposition. The theory has several continuing shoots similar to that coming off of it. For example, there is one side of it that says several different cults or quote-unquote satanic rings who perform human sacrifices are just doing it as a means of sending a soul back to the tree for replenishing, as well as other theories that say whenever the tree finally runs out of souls completely, that is the apocalypse and when the world will end. So yeah, soulless people are put on the world simply as morality speech checks. Try not to think about it too much. Incorruptible saints is a phenomenon that has been reported specifically in Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches. According to these religions, several people have been found throughout history whose bodies have been completely untouched by decomposition. Specifically throughout the 14 and 1600s, bodies were exhumed that had been buried for hundreds of years, and whenever they were found, it seemed as if the person was simply sleeping. This has been such a common occurrence that there's actually a rule in Orthodox common law that says a bishop has to show up and affirm that the body is in fact incorruptible. In several of the instances where an incorruptible saint was found, they were placed underneath the altar of churches as it was shown God had favor on that person, and hopefully that favor will apply to the church. Also, for those that don't know, to be considered a saint within Orthodox and Catholic tradition, there is a set of requirements that the person has to do, and one of them is to perform a miracle. For a long time, having an incorruptible body was seen as a miracle in itself. So if that person followed the other steps in their life that qualified them for sainthood, and then their body was found to be incorruptible, they were then affirmed as a saint. Between things like this and Saint Padre Pio Stigmata and the miracle of Lanciano, which are things I'm going to casually mention and maybe talk about in the future, this has been seen as evidence to some as proof of the Christian God. We're now breaking into the first philosophy one, which there's going to be several more of, with the God of the Gaps never existed. Now, it's kind of debated where the phrase God of the Gaps first originated. Nietzsche said in one of his writings, specifically I believe it was in On Priest, that he said whenever there is a gap in human understanding, Christians specifically fill it with God, and that's where God comes from. So according to Nietzsche, God isn't real, and whenever people say there is a God, it's just because humanity can't explain something, and God makes for a good scapegoat. The other place the phrase may have come from is from Henry Drummond, who was an evangelist who also accused the idea of God of the Gaps as being a lazy write-off for understanding. Drummond said that Christians constantly have these gaps in their knowledge that they choose to fill with God, and that was the wrong way of going about it. According to Drummond, God either has to be the God of everything, or he just simply doesn't exist. In other words, we can't have God be this spontaneous miracle worker who shows up to fill in things that we can't quite explain, and then explain the rest away as natural processes of science. In other words, God is either absolute or he doesn't exist, and that's what God of the Gaps never existed twisted is trying to get across. See, the whole God of the Gaps mentality is believed by many to be part of the reason that Christianity and belief itself has declined so much in the last century. In other words, before modern science, there really wasn't a way to explain the world outside of some supernatural entity. But now science is at a near complete point in understanding the world around us. Those gaps have gotten smaller. So people who apply God to those gaps have caused God to become smaller. This is why the concept is considered a bad thing by both evangelists and atheists. The reason that it's this low on the iceberg is because it implies that if there is a divine creator or some God above us, then it has to be 100% all-encompassing in every aspect of our lives. This is sort of the antithesis to the agnostic point of view. There can't be a God who works some of the time and then everything else is science, because if we just apply God to those little miracles, we'll eventually figure out that they're all different rules.
Halt! Get away from... Do not...
Is this what passes for a mystic of the Maruk?
Oh, Nara! I am sorry.
Pathetic.
You were awake. I am glad to see you are okay. Oh, did you want to talk to me? Fair quickly. You must tell the Kanamatra all that has happened.
Rules of the world that we live in. So if we were created, then a creator had to inspire and create every single one of those rules, meaning that the entire human experience is completely curated, which is either very comforting or very terrifying depending on who you are. Oil and resources from humans is the rather depressing thought that there is a good chance a lot of biofuel comes from humans. Now, while with crude oil it could take, a really long time for the matter of humans to compress into it, it is not a secret that humans go through methogenesis, where their body produces methane, which is absolutely a fuel. So the theory saying that perhaps the methane gas that you use to heat your home isn't entirely dinosaur fuel and could potentially be one of the 108 billion people who have died on this planet. And of course, some have taken this theory farther to say that perhaps those in power have figured out a quick way to make crude oil and that humans are being farmed as the resource. Feelings autosuppression relates to a sort of global desensitization that has taken place over the last several decades. So to make it more personal, remember the first time that you saw a scary face pop up on YouTube or in a movie and you were a little kid and it scared you really bad, but then after you saw more and more over and over, you kind of quit caring? And you know how that same thing also happened with human suffering? Like the first time you may have heard about a dangerous attack against a group of people, you were very worried, but then it just became such a common thing you quit caring. That constant loop of negative emotions can cause you to suppress them whenever they come to the surface, which is a totally natural human response. However, when this response happens across the entire population for years on end, the results can be a little concerning, particularly on the next generations moving forward. In other words, children today are not nearly as worried or concerned about world events as perhaps the generation before them was at their age, because this constant stream of negativity has served to cause a worldwide auto-suppression of negative emotions. Not only that, but it's been shown that apathy or simply holding in emotions can cause feelings of depression as well as illnesses if gone on for too long. So similar to earlier on the iceberg where I said that things like toxoplasmosis has changed the whole of human history, simply disregarding our basic human emotions has quite potentially changed the course of humanity forever. Adult film stars leeching your energy is the natural conclusion of several things that I've talked about up until this point. Remember the succubus that I talked about way back? Essentially these demonic or spiritual entities that want to steal your life force. And I believe it was in the last year I talked about erotic energy that you literally give off whenever you give off those emotions. Well, in the 21st century, what do you think would be the most effective way for those entities to steal that energy from you? That's right, the internet. And according to this, the energy that you feel being drained from you afterwards is quite literally energy that has been drained from you. Earlier in the iceberg, I talked about Kundalini energy and how it can be stolen from someone over a distance. Well, this is saying that perhaps through the digital screen, it has been stolen from thousands, if not millions of people for the past few decades, and no one's the wiser. Virus 23 is kind of the predecessor to things like the Despair Code. According to various board posts, Virus 23 has traced its way all the way back to old Cold War Russian documents, specifically documents that were researching mimetic entities. There's this entire theory that's worked its way around the globe for a while around things like shared consciousness and shared stories. I've talked about earlier on this iceberg, and I know I keep saying that, but this is the final tier and it does put the bow on a lot of theories. But I talked earlier about how someone on one side of the planet can develop these spontaneous ideas at the same time that someone on the other side of the planet does as well. Well, this isn't only seen in things like technology, but is also seen in things like theories and ideas and philosophy. And because things like human thought patterns and memory aren't fully understood, there's a belief that this exists in a sort of cloud that encompasses everyone at once. So if this does exist as a sort of shared memory bank, is it possible to transmit a virus through it? Virus 23 works as a self-replicating mental contagion. In other words, once one person is conscious of it, that causes them to think of it. It then goes to this sort of cloud of human understanding and is continued to pass down through the line. Some have even said that this virus was originally started by Cicada, which, if you'll remember, like back in Tier 2, were the people who hosted that sort of nationwide scavenger hunt. And while some think merely hearing the words Virus 23 is
must be protected at
enough
all costs.
I don't think an outsider can really understand the gravity of the situation, Kanamatra.
Then I
transmit the
will
virus,
educate them.
I don't believe that
The horn is our most Before the dragons departed, a ceremony was held at the site. In times of great strife, blow the horn and we will answer, the dragon said. Onara herself blessed the horn, summoning great winds to blow through it. That was the only time the horn has sounded in our great history. Though it has been centuries since the green dragons left these lands, they entrusted the Maruk with protecting them. I have to believe that the dragons will still honor our pact of friendship and come to our aid when we sound the horn. But that pact and our entire way of life is now threatened by that fool Balakar and his selfish bid for power. Let us hope the Tirai who guard the horn have held out. You are welcome at my fire. Come back. Khan's guard. I am entering the village with the outsider. Stay and defend this position as we advance. This is nowhere near the full forces of Clan Nokun.
Is what the theory is going with. See, with a lot of those documents and the idea of mimetic entities, it standing and is continued to pass down through the line. Some have even said that this virus was originally started by Cicada, which, if you'll remember, like back in Tier 2, were the people who hosted that sort of nationwide scavenger hunt. And while some think merely hearing the words Virus 23 is enough to transmit the virus, I don't believe that is what the theory is going with. See, with a lot of those documents and the idea of mimetic entities, it particularly is saying that it can be hidden within an unassuming thing. In other words, it could be a story, it could be a character, it could be a phrase, or whatever. Some random stories or media or folklore or whatever could exist as these sort of trip mines throughout the human understanding that, whenever stepped on, could cause, I don't know, paranoia or depression or some negative thing. I mean, I imagine it's not positive. I imagine if you get Virus 23, you don't become like an upstanding citizen all of a sudden. What makes this, if it was to be real, more threatening than the Despair Code is you could at least see the Despair Code coming, whereas Virus 23 could literally be anything. Pancreas denial. Have you ever seen your pancreas? That's what I thought, moving on. I'm just kidding, that's not the theory, but it would be really funny if it was. According to the theory, your pancreas is actually your third chakra and is used to filter things like really be anything. Pancreas denial. Have you ever seen your pancreas? That's what I thought, moving on. I'm just kidding, that's not the theory, but it would be really funny if it was. According to the theory, your pancreas is actually your third chakra and is used to filter things like negative energy. Supposedly, the powers that be that know about the power of the pancreas don't want the common person to have access to the pancreas's true capabilities. So they have done things like store negative energy in our food, in the media we consume,
Almost there. Now!
Mother!
Let the winds carry us onward. The Emerald Gardens will fall!
Well met. Onward. Farewell.
Kanamatra! Was that the horn of your soul? It was loud enough to
and
wake the dead.
other nefarious
Yes,
means
more
of
let force don't
anti-pancreas
take less
propaganda
power.
as a means
The
to
horn
stifle
will
the
lure
human
dragons
spirit.
into a trap.
And if you've heard of someone getting their pancreas removed, it's simply because their filter was too clogged with all of the negative energy in the world. Patterns manipulation in itself is really broad, but I'm going to look at a specific avenue of it. Essentially, it's saying that there are patterns that exist within thought and reality as a whole. In other words, everything from how you think to the world you exist in revolves around these certain patterns. Several people who experiment with psychotropic drugs say that while under the influence of them, they begin to see patterns and other designs creep up in the world around them. A lot of this relates back to things like sacred geometry. And human thought patterns are called just that because people tend to think in regards to what they know. In other words, if you are trying to get someone to believe a different truth or the truth you want them to, you begin by starting with things that they already know as fundamental truth and working your way from there because human brains exist in these realm of patterns. If I was to just run up to you and say that Bigfoot's in my backyard, you may say, "You're crazy. Why are you telling me this? Get out of my house." But if I was to approach you and say, you know, there's several species of gorillas that have existed that kind of just disappeared from the biological tree, and every time that we go searching in the forest, we find new species of monkey here and there who are normally in endangered populations, well, who's to say that one of these species of gorillas didn't get really tall and they just migrated their way north from South America, and now one of them's in my backyard? You'll still probably tell me to get out of your house, but what I did is I worked off of something that you know and then changed it from there. Therefore, by manipulating the patterns of your own thought, I got you to a conclusion that you never would have accepted otherwise. The theory is saying that perhaps this same manipulation could exist within reality. Concepts like magic or illusion can be performed in legitimacy if that person can manipulate the patterns reality works within. In a sense, this is similar to a lot of what modern science and chemistry have been able to do in themselves. They have understood how the fundamental world works around them and then manipulated it within its own rules to get it to a place that you would have been executed for in the Dark Ages. And if I'm able to convince you about Bigfoot, then what could be possible if someone really tapped into the patterns of the world around us? Ascension Blacklist is implying that there are some people who will not be allowed to ascend to the next plane of existence. Think about it this way: if souls do exist as these eternal entities, and if things like reincarnation exist, then who's to say that some can't remember past instances or have a greater understanding of the world around us? So obviously, these people who may have a higher plane of knowledge than the rest of us could have grudges against people here on Earth. Ascension Blacklist is postulating that perhaps the purpose of secret societies like the Illuminati or insert other creepy shadow government thing is to decide who will and will not be allowed in eternity. Getting into theories like this is fun because there's entire things talking about the NPCs from earlier, how they are used specifically to target the people who have been blacklisted, and that in some cases the people who have been blacklisted can be such a positive influence to those NPCs that they get back on the entry list. But the short of it for this video is saying that secret societies or secret organizations who have a better understanding of the eternity and of the human soul have a say in who is and is not allowed in. Oikiosis, and according to the internet that is how it's pronounced, I looked one up this time, is closely related to ideas of Stoicism. So without getting into hundreds of years of philosophizing, Stoicism is essentially the idea that the purpose of life is a perfection of the human soul. In other words, life itself is a sort of test for how one will be judged in the afterlife. Now, if you're familiar with most religions, this isn't a crazy far out there concept, or at least you've heard of it before. However, oikiosis is where the interesting part comes in. Oikiosis is roughly translated to relation or someone's relationship with something else. Applied to Stoicism, oikiosis is saying that one of the chief concepts of humanity is that humanity's perfection is defined by its interaction with others. So if one is to achieve this quote-unquote perfect soul, it has to be through actions of charity and goodness to other people. The reason it's on this iceberg is due to something called Dasein's teachings, or Dasein. Dasein is a German concept that was brought up around the 19th century that said oikiosis is falling apart because of humanity's increased isolation. In other words, humans over the years have become more self-centered and self-interested, and that has caused the very fabric of their souls to fall apart because they are no longer performing acts of goodness or charity with others because they're more invested in their own devices. A lot of applications of this come down to anti-tech stuff and, like iPhone bad. But in short, it's saying that partial, if not all of humanity has been doomed because we've quit striving for that human perfection. For soul removal is the idea that every human is born with a soul, but it can be taken from you. Not only through things like occult rituals, which those also count, but even things like traumatic events or just simple disbelief can cause pieces of your soul to whittle away over time. This leaves the individual open to attack, where negative spirits can come and fill in that place that they left open within their soul, and that's where things like possession come from. Not only that, but this theory says that wayward souls that have been separated from their human host float around as sparse energy, and in large enough amounts can achieve forms like that of a ghost or a cryptid. In other words, the reason things like old asylums are so haunted is because so many people have had pieces of their soul chipped away at them in there that those pieces now just wander the area looking for their human host. And the only way to prevent things like negative souls or negative entities from attacking you is to do things like ensure a positive environment and energy for yourself and continue to believe in things, because if you don't use that space for your soul, there's a chance that something else will. Real Humans Died Millennia Ago is saying that perhaps the way we currently exist is not humanity's highest form. You know how you hear about things like the pyramid or structures like Atlantis, and people always say they had to be these super geniuses to build all of that? Well, it's saying that perhaps while technology has increased over the centuries, human thought has decreased, to the degree that us as we function now would be near unrecognizable from our ancestors. How unrecognizable, you may ask? Well, some have pointed to things that I've mentioned earlier in this iceberg, like statues of reptilians in Middle Eastern tombs. Or even old legends of things like elves or mermaids could just be other forms of humanity when we were at a higher function. Or there's even some depictions of these like really big people who used to be able to make these really cool structures because they were really tall and strong. And I'm going to contain myself now, and I'm not going to say it, so we're just going to move on. Artifice Predens relates back to the concept of the Great Cycle that I've mentioned a few times up until now. It points out the weird concept that in the human record, there seems to be these pieces of artificial construction that have shown up before we started using them. Essentially, some formed metals and elements have been found that have led the way for human innovation, but now we have to manufacture, so it's kind of weird that they were there to begin with. Also, remember some of those things I talked about earlier in the iceberg, like how microchips or fuses have been found in ancient pottery? Or the idea like structures like pyramids and aqueducts were seemingly discovered and then forgotten and then rediscovered? This all relates back to
Wheatley vodka. Distilled 10 times, so you actually want to taste it.
Relates back to the concept of the Great Cycle and says that perhaps the previous people or whatever existed in our stead left behind some pieces either on purpose or accident that were the foundation of our cycle, and so on and so forth. Hiring a hitman on yourself. is something else. This is more of a thought concept than anything else, and while I think it's funny that it's this low on the iceberg, it may be just a little bit misplaced. So it's known that in several religions or spiritual practices, committing self-unexist is generally frowned upon. So the hiring a hitman on yourself asks the philosophical question, is it the action or the intent that would condemn somebody? With some stating that hiring a hitman on yourself would be a way to subvert the consequences of the thing that would eventually accomplish. Or if you were ever just bored and wanted to make your life more challenging, you could just do that anyway and then try to survive, and it would make your week a lot more interesting. Roman Empire Still Rules the World originally comes from the author Philip K. Dick, which I talked about earlier on this iceberg. A lot of people believe that he was more in tune with the underhanded goings on in the world than most people. And in one of the stories he wrote later in his life, he said that the Roman Empire never collapsed, and instead several of its senators went into hiding and became the foundation for modern New World Orders or secret societies. In other words, they didn't maintain their population or space, but they did maintain their influence. There's even a book written called Descent that talked about how the Roman Empire went into the caverns of the hollow earth and exist as a quite literal underbelly of the world's government at large. And also, if you wanted to say that, whenever the Roman Empire fell, that's when like the Vatican and the Catholic Church really took off. And they got a whole lot of influence. So, fractalization is very closely related to pattern manipulation, because fractalization is believed to be the patterns of reality itself. People who experiment with very heavy psychotropic drugs like DMT and LSD say that whenever they're experiencing the high, they begin to see the world or a sort of plane of fractals. In other words, these geometric patterns that separate the world at large into these shapes. Some refer to this plane of existence as hyperreality, and there's some who even believe that this is the true state of being and the human condition is just numb to it. In other words, we exist in a dull state of mind on sort of the first level of our reality, and doing things that cause your mind to leave that reality lets you see the world for what it truly is, or at least a different realm that exists around us. I'll be 100% honest with you guys, things like this really interest me, but I'm also very, very dumb to, and it's something in the future that I'm going to research more. Well, not like I'm not going there, but it's something that I'm going to look into more, because some of the stuff here, as someone who reads about this stuff all the time, really freaks me out, and I mean that in the best way. Paleolithic deep state is another one of those natural conclusions to things mentioned earlier on the iceberg. So remember how I talked about how Neanderthals supposedly didn't die, they just kind of went away and did their own thing for a while? Well, this is saying perhaps they went underground, maybe even literally, and began the structures of the world's government and society as we know it now. Now, according to this, they wouldn't still be in the state we know of them in the historical record. If Homo sapien adapted, then the Neanderthal would adapt as well. But with things like their disappearance from the historical record, as well as odd cave art that shows these kind of human things existing around humans as we know them, implies to some that maybe they achieved some higher form of being, whether that being an underground deep state like I mentioned earlier as the first New World Order, or maybe as some ascended form of person. Also, while researching this, I saw a theory that said Cain is the leader of them, that wouldn't still be in the state we know of them in the historical record. If Homo sapien adapted, then the Neanderthal would adapt as well. But with things like their disappearance from the historical record, as well as odd cave art that shows these kind of human things existing around humans as we know them, implies to some that maybe they achieved some higher form of being, whether that being an underground deep state like I mentioned earlier as the first New World Order, or maybe as some ascended form of person. Also, while researching this, I saw a theory that said Cain is the leader of them, and that he never died, and that he's leading the Neanderthal New World Order, and I had nowhere to add that in, but that is too cool not to, and we're moving on. Depression overriding seems really simple at first, but it's the spiritual implications that put it on this level. If you are depressed or sad or any negative emotion, and you manage to find a way within your head to flip that around into a positive emotion, that may not seem like a lot to you, but if you view things like energy and spiritualism as tangible things, then you just committed a form of spiritual alchemy. This relates to the idea that humans are a much more powerful creature than most of us realize. And if we're so concerned with things like the energy and the spiritual and the extra dimensions around us and everything else, we take for granted the little sort of miracles that we can perform. Things like turning a negative energy into a positive one. And if physical energy, as we understand it in physics, cannot be created or destroyed, then perhaps spiritual energy cannot be created or destroyed either, only converted. And by doing something as wild as converting negative energy, you're exercising a form of supernatural powers. So, if you want to get really out there with all our postulations, take something like Virus 23 or the solar plexus clown glider or whatever, and imagine those mimetic agents that are meant to harm you. Well, if you have the capability to convert that into a positive force, then there's no telling what's possible now, is there? Incorings are referring to the absolutes that exist in human culture. In other words, take all the human cultures that exist around the world who for a long time never had contact with each other. You will always see some absolutes, things like weaponry, religion, language, or things like statues or burial sites or just monuments in general. For whatever reason, it seems like these things are engraved on people as a whole. You could view this as a sort of puzzle. If we're to figure out what our purpose on Earth is or what existence means as a whole, then maybe we have the pieces to figure it out, and everyone has their own pieces, we just haven't really put it together yet. So let's take that another step forward with all the weird theories we've talked about to this point, and think about something like the Great Cycle, which I'm going to keep mentioning because it's really cool. Think about how often things like pyramids supposedly pop up through the cycles, or things like human history traveling along the same path. If one was to truly believe in things like reincarnation and the idea that we are being tested over and over again to figure out what we're supposed to do, maybe if someone can throw all of this together, it would break the cycle. Soy Grand Theory, because I know you've been waiting for the finale of the government-sanctioned weaponized femboys, and here it is. Soy Grand Theory is saying that the soyification of society isn't even reliant on soy. It's solely reliant on the cultural shift caused by it. In other words, the effects of soy has caused permanent damage to the human population that cannot be reversed, and the influence of soy products on humanity will lead to a totalitarian femboy empire. You're welcome. Golden Rules of Nature is related to the 5 basic Golden Rules of Nature. The idea is for something to survive within nature, it has to have balance, growth, connection, harmonization, and love. Now that sounds weird, but let's break that down. You have to be balanced in the way you live. You can't be one way or the other. And this applies not only to humans, but things in nature as a whole. You have to grow. If you're stagnant for too long, you'll be dead. And you have to be connected to the world around you, because isolation also leads to death. You have to harmonize with the world around you, because if you take too much or are too violent, that will eventually come back on you. And the love is saying that there has to be a passion or drive, because depression is a killer. So that's kind of weird to have that little slice of life knowledge this low on the iceberg. But the implications of it is, if the physical realm is representative of the spiritual realm, then perhaps those 5 rules also apply to the spiritual. If one is not balanced, grown, connected, harmonized, and in love with their spiritual lifestyle, then that leads to a spiritual death. And since things like spiritualism aren't exactly exemplified in the modern age, this is saying that because we're not following those 5 rules, society as a whole is spiritually dying and will I'm sure lead to something bad in the future because we are not treating spiritual existence in the same way we treat physical existence. We are now down to the final 5 terms of the conspiracy theory iceberg, and I saved these 5 for a particular reason. I think they're not only some of the biggest overall topics, but it seems like a fitting place to close this iceberg on. God
Turn before they see you.
Shop Michael's Great Big Holiday Sale to save on everything you need to make the season magical. Hurry, sale ends December 6th.
What do you want?
Want a job that I don't hate. What did you
on. God's ego death in research is, I think, probably the most misinterpreted one on the entire iceberg. Everywhere I looked in research for this, people were hyper-focusing on the ego term. See, ego, as it's understood in psychology, is the self, or it's the idea of oneself. So in that sense, you would think ego death, as it's often called within the hero's journey of storytelling, would mean the destroying of one's own opinion or perspective. In other words, if you have a character in a story who has very hard-set fundamental beliefs, and then something happens to them and they change those beliefs, that is considered an ego death. However, what I think this iceberg is getting across, because everything else on the iceberg kind of points that direction, is the other definition of ego death. An ego death or ego loss is what is considered in very, very hardcore drug trips whenever someone's soul leaves their person. Or even more specifically, whenever your soul escapes your mind and your concept of thought and existence. In other words, it's separating part of yourself from another part of yourself. Here, when it says God's ego death, it's not talking about a change of heart God had. It's talking about God's separation of God himself. Think about it this way. Remember when I was talking about the God of the gaps didn't exist earlier, and it got across the notion that everything has to be either the total creation of God or none of it was? Well, if every part of existence is a part of God himself, then that implies that at some point God was just one entity. See, if at one point God was just one being that existed as a perfect form of existence, then anything that he created other than himself had to be a step down. So in this form, God's ego death was a departure from himself into this other existence. It was, in a sense, the death of the one true perfection. Some have even taken this theory as to be the root of fractals themselves. Remember how I mentioned that people who have these crazy experiences say the entire world exists in these patterns, or that things like human thought and reality exist in patterns? Perhaps these broken patterns are the pieces of God separated from one perfect entity into the world around us. We hear of concepts in Christianity like the Trinity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and imagine God separating himself into 3, and this is extending it to the point that God separated himself into everything. But why would God do that? Why would a singular perfect being stoop himself to the point of humanity in order to create them? And that goes into the next theory, God's last wish. One commonality that is seen across nearly every religion is that in the beginning, in creation, God created humanity in order to have a companion. But it's not exactly a companion if it's just a clone of yourself that's as perfect as you are. So according to this, God's last wish, the thing that he broke himself into infinite pieces for in order to begin creation, was in order to create free will. The one thing that God ruled as being better than divinity was the existence of choice. And again, in nearly every religion, the core idea is that humanity separated themselves from God because of a selfish choice. And it's the concept that in the end, humanity exists as pieces of God who have done whatever they've wanted to with that free will. And according to that, because we finally get a happy theory on this iceberg, every single person is a piece of the perfect God who has been given the opportunity in their life to demonstrate how they will use that perfect soul to do whatever choices they wish. And the reason this is such a big deal and so low on the iceberg is because it implies that humanity does in fact have a purpose, and that purpose is a demonstration of the concept of choice in order to eventually return to the companionship with God in divinity. In other words, God's last wish is saying that God destroyed absolute perfection in order to give humanity their own chance. And then finally, we're into the last 3 entries of the conspiracy theory iceberg, and all 3 of them are very closely related. There is no conspiracy refers to the idea that there is no objective truth that is being hidden from us. It's kind of weird to get all the way to the bottom of the iceberg and then to hear it say that no conspiracy is actually real. But what this is saying is that there is no secret society, there is no hidden power, there is no shadow government, or anything else that has a better grasp of the human condition than we ourselves. See, there's this weird kind of comfort in the idea that there is some grand truth or grand secret of the universe that's just being hidden from us. Because then, if someone else is hiding it from us, that means it's something that we can understand and something that we can put together. But if the truth is in actuality that we're all just as lost as each other and there is no one person in control, that makes the conclusion all the more terrifying. Any hidden order or grasp to maintain power is just someone else exactly like us trying to find purpose in a world that confuses us. In short, there can be no leader if all of us are lost, and in a way, everyone is trying to find their own path. Which leads directly into the next theory: all conspiracies are true. I know it's kind of weird to have one be no conspiracy is real and then all conspiracies are real, but they're talking about 2 different things. No conspiracy is true is saying that there is no grand conspiracy against you, the person. Whereas all conspiracies are true is saying that all hidden truths or hidden secrets of the world are interconnected. I've kind of mentioned this before with ideas of the grand unified religious theory or the grand unified conspiracy theory. If you've paid attention up until this point, then you've probably realized there's a lot of concepts and ideas that sound really similar to each other, they just have a couple words mixed around. The idea behind this is that every understanding of religion, esoteric nature, karma, chakras, spiritualism, and what have you are all getting back to the root source. So no, it's not referring to the idea that the earth is both round and flat and a donut and hollow and inside out, sadly, but the idea that all of these broad concepts of human nature are branches of the same tree that we're all working our way to the roots of. And concepts like this can be overwhelming. It seems to a lot of people who spend a lot of time in topics like this that the world is this impossible puzzle that is never meant to be understood. This is the same reason that a lot of people who dedicate their lives to religious and supernatural studies end up with a feeling of insignificance. It's hard to try to grasp the concept of everything and to not come out feeling like a nothing. But that's where the final concept of the conspiracy theory iceberg comes in, the final understanding. The final understanding is thought to be the destination of most forms of spiritual practice and meditation. In other words, cultures that have developed ideas of things like nirvana, enlightenment, ascension, or what have you, all come back to one core idea. And sadly, I can't just say some magical phrase that will automatically make you achieve a higher plane of existence, at least not yet. However, there is one idea that permeates whenever you're looking at things like conspiracy theories or hidden secrets of the world that keeps coming back as a constant. And that is the idea that your perspective is with purpose. Think about all the crazy stuff I've talked about that has to do with metaphysics and magic and geometry and esoteric religion and theoretical science and what have you. A lot of these concepts can seem so big that they swallow up the concept of the individual. And while yeah, some of these theories are bigger than the scope of one person, there is no theory that is beyond the reach of one person. In other words, if you're trying to achieve a higher plane of meditation, or a deeper grasp of conceptual science that isn't real yet, or an understanding of ultra realities, or learning about the lost gaps in human history, or trying to figure out secret religions that have been covered up for decades, or anything in between. Every single concept is tailor-made for you, the individual. And even if in some of them you can't always be an active participant, you are designed to be the one true witness. Whenever talking about things like the human soul and eternity, it's really hard to kind of narrow it down to a place that we can grab it because it seems beyond our reach. When in actuality, if it's some hidden secret or supernatural knowledge we want to learn about, we have the key. The best way I heard this described is that everything is you and everything is me. Because in the entirety of human thought, there has never been one concept, theory, or idea that was made by humanity in the absence of humanity. In other words, don't spend your life worrying that you're missing out on something greater than yourself, because according to the final understanding, you're right where you're supposed to be. And with that, we have the end of the conspiracy theory iceberg. While I was researching the final understanding, I normally do like word searches or phrase searches to see where they pop up online, and I found a Reddit post from 11 months ago where someone was asking about the final understanding, and a guy replied and said, I don't know, but there's this YouTuber Wendigoon who is currently doing a series on it. He just got done with the first episode, but one day he'll get there. So make sure you're watching when he does. And now, here I am, and I made it, and we all made it. And whenever I started, I never thought that I would get this far, yet here we are. And I just want to say to the guy who said that, and to everyone who was watching in the beginning, and everyone who picked up along the way, and to everyone who's here now, thank you for watching. I am absolutely bewildered about everything that's happened over the course of this year. Whenever I started the first episode of this series, I had, I think, 900 subscribers, maybe 1,000. It was close. Maybe 800 or 900. But either way, in 21 episodes of this series, I am now sitting at around 911,000 subscribers. And like, at first, whenever I made the first couple videos and there was some traction, I was so excited. I'm like, alright, I can make this conspiracy theory iceberg and people will watch. That's so exciting. And then I said, well, maybe I can make other iceberg videos. And people watched that. And I said, maybe I can make other creepy content. And that just kept snowballing to now I feel like I have the opportunity to talk about whatever I want to talk about and tell whatever stories I want to get across. And I don't want to sound like I'm taking it for granted or I expect it to be there, but it feels like because of the support I've seen so far that someone will be watching. And as someone who's just wanted to be a
I need to target something first.
Tell me of your dreams. From the hunters who value skill above all, a rite of passage, a first. From the mystics who commune with the wind, her lightest touch, a lift. From the descendants of the matriarch, a drop of unbroken progeny, an ancient line, unforgotten.
My first kill was quite some time ago. Nothing of it remains. Absolutely not. Try again. Yes, that makes sense. After their first hunt, a young hunter of our clan receives a ceremonial spear. Take mine.
What would you ask of me? This spear is proof of your skill. I accept this offering.
I do not think it is that sort of verse. We should think of something else. As all Ohuna are the offspring of Onara, this feather should suffice.
Hello, champion. Tell me of your dream. Onara's spirit blesses us all. I accept your offering.
That does not make sense to me. A bloodline. I have an idea. Here, take this. Follow the wind.
What would you ask? I remember Tira well. You are so much like her. I accept your offering. Hello, champion.
You are welcome at my... I, the Kanamatra Serist, accept this gift to honor the ancient oath made by our most sacred ancestor. All Centaur under Onara's wings will aid the Green Dragonflight in times of need.
And I, Marithra, daughter of Ysera, accept this gift to honor my oath to your ancestor Tira. Together, dragons and Centaur will protect the Onaran Plains.
Should the dream be threatened again, know that the Maruk will fight beside you.
The bond that united us in ages past has been renewed. Let this oath stone serve as a symbol of our covenant. I vow to protect the Emerald Dream and the Green Dragonflight with my life. What would you ask of me? Is it time to go already?
I have many lucky do's how you like. Many farewells.
Tell me of your dreams. May your dreams be peaceful.
Your presence is a favorable omen. Good luck.
storyteller and now has that opportunity. I didn't just get the camera to make the videos look better, and I don't want to go into
What do you want? Want a job that I don't hate.
Hello everybody, today we're going to talk about what is in my opinion the most overlooked battle of World War II, and that is the Battle of Castle Itter. And you read the title right. This is a battle in which the Americans and Germans teamed up to save a group of French celebrities. Every aspect of this battle is wild, from the events that led up to the battle taking place, to the people involved, obviously, to even how it turned out in the end. Like, trust me, by the end of this thing, it's going to be so weird. You're going to love it. But to set the stage for how all of this came together, I need to explain some of the circumstances at the end of World War II that allowed an alliance like this to take place. So the end of World War II was a very weird time for the Germans. If you were a German in Berlin fighting the Russians, good luck. Because the Russian destruction of not only the city of Berlin, but of the German High Command kind of dismantled the entire army. Because of that, if you were a German soldier on the Western Front who was responsible with keeping the Americans and British at bay, then you kind of just had to figure it out. By the end of April, Hitler was already dead, and the only commands coming from up top were to just hold out. So as you could imagine, several of the Germans began to see the writing on the wall and realized the war was almost over. Now, your options for what you did going forward mostly depended on your position during the war. The two main distinctions, and for all of my World War II fanatics like myself, I realize that this is an oversimplification and that there were more factions, but for the sake of the video, this is all that's important. There were two main types of German soldiers, the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. The Wehrmacht, and again I know I'm oversimplifying, was essentially the army. It was the primary composure of most of the fighting forces for Germany during World War II. Whereas the SS was a fighting force directly formed from the Nazi Party. Meaning not only were they a typically more elite force than the standard Wehrmacht troop, but during the war they performed more of the party's objectives, like, you know, war crimes. So because of that, as the war was ending, the Wehrmacht had a pretty good chance if they just surrendered. Typically during most modern wars, once the war's over, people who were just veterans of the other side aren't treated too harshly, as long as they were typically just military combatants. Now, things that the SS did are seen as a little less favorable to politics and history, like, you know, the Holocaust. So as the war in Europe was ending in early May of 1945, several of the Wehrmacht troops began to surrender, while several of the SS dug in and were prepared to fight to the end. And it's within that setting of Wehrmacht and SS troops stationed on the northern border of Austria in the Tyrol region that our story takes place. And what better place to begin our story than with the story of Castle Itter itself. And speaking of castles with weird towers, how about this tower? Do you know what this tower is? This tower is the phenomenal work that you guys have done on the Kickstarter. For those that don't know, I am making a movie with the writer and director of the SCP Overlord and SCP Dollhouse films, and you guys have been incredibly generous and have pushed this to a stupendous level, and I cannot thank you enough. We still got a way to go, we're still not done, but it warms my heart to see me do something that I enjoy and that I'm passionate about, and you all to put so much faith and trust and money into it, like directly backing it, means the world in a way I could never fully explain, and thank you all for that. Like I said, we still got a way to go, I'm very excited for this. For those that don't know, I will link the video where I discuss the project in detail in the description, but it is going to be a horror action film set within the universe of the Stalker video game franchise. It's going to be cool, trust me. And we are currently running a Kickstarter for it that has all the information you can be in per serving. But not only is Magic Spoon the most healthy breakfast option, in some or stationing officers or what have you. So in 1943, it grabbed Castle Itter and began to use it as a prison for its important prisoners. And it had some very important prisoners. In the early years of its operation, it had the former Italian Prime Minister Francesco Nitti, as well as the former President of France, Albert Lebrun. And using a castle as a prison made a lot of sense. It only has one entrance, is heavily fortified on all sides, and is very easy to defend. And the prisoners who were put at Itter were kept in relatively good conditions. See, the Germans knew that it may be beneficial to have these former political leaders in good health, because in the future they could probably use it for leverage. Several of the prisoners who stayed there described the experience as being very bizarre, because while yeah, they couldn't leave, they each had their own room, they had a free roam of the hallways, they could go out to the courtyard and exercise when they wanted, and while the guards would be rude if, they ever asked for anything too extraneous, most of the prisoners said the guards would try to be their friend. At the end of the war, several of the prisoners present included the sister of French free leader Charles Gaulle, two former French prime ministers, several French generals, and even French Olympic tennis athlete Jean Borotra. Again, all highly regarded individuals of France who Germany thought may be useful. One interesting detail is that apparently several of these people hated each other because a bunch of the politicians who were locked up were like far right and far left. And then you had several fighters and generals of the French army who were in there at the same time as politicians who were favorable of Germany at the beginning of the war. So apparently the German guards never had to worry about them planning an escape because they could never get along with each other long enough to actually plan something. Now, as mentioned earlier, Itter was a part of the Dachau concentration camp, and the concentration camps were staffed by SS members. Because of that, the head at Castle Itter was a man named Sebastian Weimer, a high-ranking officer in the SS. So, as the war was coming to a close, things got a lot more tumultuous at the castle. At the beginning it started off slow, like in 1945 the supply lines got low, so instead of lighting the castle with light bulbs that were ran by a generator, they had to begin using candles. Near the end of the war, the prisoners had a meeting with Weimar and essentially asked if things got really bad, if they were going to, be executed. And Weimar made the good point that it would not be in his interest, as someone who's already going to get in a lot of trouble for being an SS officer, to execute a bunch of important people at the end of the war for no reason. And he said that if it came down to it, he would make sure they had a way out. Well, in late April, as the final weeks of the war were beginning, the castle became a checkpoint for SS officers who were trying to escape the Allies. Several of the officers who worked at the Dachau concentration camps would come to the castle and get their families and supplies together before making a run for it. Because again, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, a lot of the SS did not have an option other than get out or fight. This culminated when on April 30th, Edward Wieder showed up to the castle. Edward Wieder is known as the Butcher of Dachau because he was the head of the Dachau concentration camp. And whenever he left for the castle at the end of April, he ordered the execution of the 2,000 remaining prisoners. April 30th was also the same day Hitler died, so whenever the Butcher massacred that many people on the same day that it was very apparent Germany was not going to win this thing, he took the third option and shot himself in the heart while he was in Castle Itter on May the 2nd. Which, funny side note, there is a village known as Village Itter at the base of Castle Itter, because the way it used to be set up in Europe is there'd be a big castle and then a village built next to it. So his men tried to bury him in the cemetery at Village Itter, and the priest of the town began to fight them and essentially say he doesn't want a murderer buried in his yard because duh. So they just buried him at an unmarked grave just outside the castle wall. It was at this point, after watching his boss commit Battlefield 5 exit lobby, that the head of Castle Itter, Weimar, decided to get out. So on May the 4th, Weimar begins to make a run for it. However, the prisoners protested, saying, hey, what happened to the whole "you're gonna let us go" thing? And Weimar says that he will make sure that they are guarded so that no danger befalls them. And all that Weimar did to ensure they were taken care of was, as he was making a run for it, he found an injured SS officer who had defected from the SS and asked him to put on his uniform and go protect the castle by himself. This SS officer, who to my understanding the name has been lost to history, had become injured in battle months prior and decided to leave the SS as he became disillusioned with it. So I guess he was just like, sure, I'll die protecting a bunch of French people, why not? Also, after Weimar left, all of the guards at the prison decided to leave as well. So by May the 4th, it was an entire castle of French prisoners and one not SS guard, and that was it. Now, the prisoners made the logical conclusion, considering that the SS soldiers in the area were desperate, that they weren't just going to leave a castle to itself. They would either storm in there and kill the French to take the castle as a defensive position, or just because they really don't have anything else going for them. So the French prisoners broke into the castle's armory that the Germans had just left intact, and they all began to arm themselves. Now, logically, they figured that they themselves were not going to be able to hold out against an entire SS regime. So they began to develop a plan in order to get some help. At this time, the Americans were moving across the Austrian countryside, securing each village one at a time. So naturally, the Americans would be on their way to secure castle and village Itter. So all they need to do is go find one of those American patrols and let them know that, hey, there's an empty castle. You should probably do something about that. Now, this part is a bit of a historical discrepancy. I've read a lot of sources on this story, and they seem to be kind of split on what exactly happened. Some say one of the prisoners tricked the guards on May the 3rd in order to sneak out, and then he went to go contact the Americans, and then someone else went on May the 4th. However, Stephen Harding, who wrote the book on this story titled The Last Battle, believes that it was just one individual who went to both groups. And since, he wrote the book, I'm going to go with his interpretation. So according to Harding, it was one Yugoslavian prisoner by the name of Andre. Despite being a Yugoslavian, he was transferred to the castle at the end of the war because the castle needed electrical work and Andre was an electrician. So on May the 4th, those who could speak English at the castle wrote out a message on a note that said something along the lines of, "Hi, I'm trapped in a castle and we're all gonna die, please help," and gave it to Andre so that whenever he runs into American forces, he could just show them that note, and hopefully they could put him in contact with someone who speaks German. So Andre hops on a motorcycle and begins to make his way to a nearby village known as Virgil. While on his way to Virgil, he was stopped by a group of Austrian freedom fighters on a house just outside of the village. Turns out there was a whole deployment of SS soldiers in Virgil, so it's good Andre didn't make it there. Andre explained to the freedom fighters, which was mostly composed of citizens of Austria who were fighting against the remnants of the German soldiers, that his objective was to make it to the Americans. The Austrians introduced them to their leader, the Wehrmacht Major, Joseph Gongol. Gongol was a very high-ranking German major. He had fought through the entirety of the war for the German army on the Eastern Front against the Russians, and then even at the Battle of Normandy against the Americans. However, as the war went on, he became disillusioned with the German sentiment, and at the tail end of it, defected and began leading the Austrian freedom fighters against the remaining Germans. Gongol's forces were composed of himself, about 20 Wehrmacht soldiers who followed him, along with the volunteering Austrian freedom fighters. So Andre comes to this German major and explains the whole story, that there's French VIPs in a castle, and they're probably going to get attacked by the SS. And Gongol says that he himself does not have the forces to help, but he bets the Americans do. So Gongol tells Andre to continue driving in one direction until he hits the Americans in a town about 20 miles away, while Gongol himself, along with his Wehrmacht soldiers, will go the other direction to where he thinks the Americans may be. So these two, a German major with a truckload of German soldiers, as well as a Yugoslavian prisoner who doesn't speak English, both set off to find American help. On
Trust Morgan and Morgan for thepeople.com.
On Andre's side, he eventually makes it to an American deployment and hands them a letter, gets a translator, and explains everything. So they begin to travel with Andre back to the castle with a deployment of 4 tank destroyers and an infantry transport and jeeps and everything needed. However, on their way to the castle, they ran into a group of Austrian freedom fighters who were in a fight with German soldiers, and the convoy began taking artillery fire, so they had to stop. Meanwhile, Gongol made it to the nearby village of Kufstein, or Kufstein, I'm horrible with names. Gongol, driving his Kuppenwagen, which looks like this, was riding with a giant white flag hanging out the side of it, and whenever he made contact with the American tank division that was there, he got out and walked towards them holding the flag with his hands up, and was taken to the head of the 23rd Tank Battalion. Gongol explained the story, and the battalion asked for any volunteers. The volunteer who stepped up was First Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee Jr., which not only is one of the most American names ever, but for the duration of this video, I want you to imagine him as Lieutenant Aldo Raines from Inglourious Basterds, because that's exactly who this guy was. Despite joining the army from New York, he was originally from Nebraska. And despite being only 27, he had commanded his N4 Sherman tank through France, Germany, and now Austria. As a matter of fact, the day previously, on May the 3rd, he was part of the battle that cleared the Kufstein village. So this guy is at the tail end of the war. He just fought the day before, but he decides to go fight to rescue a bunch of French prisoners. Whenever he signed up, his friend who was also a tank commander, Lieutenant Harry Bass, also volunteered to go along with him. So between the tanks and crew, at this point, it was 2 tanks and 8 volunteers. On top of that, 6 volunteers from the All-African American Company D of the 17th Armored Infantry Battalion rode on top. Whenever they left, the battalion also sent 5 more tanks with them for fire support. So this group of American tanks and German soldiers began to make their way back to Castle Itter. They got to the city of Virgil, as mentioned earlier, that was full of SS soldiers. However, when they get there, they find that the SS had just left. Afraid that the SS may try to retake the town, Lee leaves the 5 support tanks that had followed them at the town to defend it. About 4 miles from Castle Itter, they passed the only bridge to the castle that had been wired to blow by the SS who had just left. Gongol soldiers, who know how to work German explosives, defuse the bomb, and after they cross the bridge, Lee leaves the other tank there in order to defend it. Because since that bridge is the only way Germans could get armor up to the castle, it's a good idea to make sure that doesn't happen. However, Henry Bass, who's Lee's friend, refuses to get left behind on the action while Lee goes to the castle, so he leaves someone else in charge of his tank while he hops on Lee's tank and goes with him. So at this point, the group that's making their way to the castle is composed of 1 tank, 7 Americans in total, and Gongol and his 20 German soldiers. As they're making their way up to the castle, they round a turn and come across a group of SS soldiers who are trying to set up a roadblock. They begin to shoot at the Germans on the road, to which Lee then tells the driver to gun it, and they all run up the road and make their way to the castle. And that roadblock was evidence that the SS were probably going to try to take the castle. Whenever they arrive, the French VIPs are not exactly thrilled, because think about it, they're afraid of a German attack, so they send Andre to go get help. And then the people who come back is 7 Americans, 1 tank, 20 Germans, no way to get them out of the castle, and no Andre. Like I said, Stephen Harding is my primary source for this story, not only because I believe he's the most accurate, but also because he includes the funniest details. One of them being the French prime ministers who were at the castle said that Gongol, the German major, was very polite and kind, whereas Lee was, quote, crude in both looks and manners. Once they get to the castle, Lee has his tank placed in the entryway so that blocks the only means of anyone walking in. And after they get there, they get some food together for all the men that are present, and then apparently cracked open the wine cellar and started just having a party. Think about it. You have a bunch of French celebrities, a bunch of German foot soldiers, a variety of American soldiers, and they're all just having drinks and partying in a castle that's about to be invaded. That night, Lee, Bass, Gongle, and the aforementioned SS officer who was guarding the castle all went out and began to set up defensive positions if the SS were to attack. I would kill to have known what they talked about. 2 American tank commanders, a Wehrmacht major, and an SS American soldiers, and they're all just having drinks and partying in a castle that's about to be invaded. That night, Lee, Bass, Gongle, and the aforementioned SS officer who was guarding the castle all went out and began to set up defensive positions if the SS were to attack. I would kill to have known what they talked about. 2 American tank commanders, a Wehrmacht major, and an SS officer all planning together. One of history's most bizarre moments. I wonder if any of them took a moment to realize just the absurdity of it. Lee certainly took the reins on the operation, and he recognized that they did not have the power to transport the prisoners out of the castle. So instead, Lee's reasoning was, for one, Andre is still out there hopefully getting help. Because if you'll remember, at this time, Andre got himself into another gunfight and wasn't able to make his way to the castle yet. And 2, the Americans are continuing to take each village one at a time, and hopefully the front line would be here soon. So in the meantime, they were going to wait there until help arrived. And sure enough, it's good they planned the defense when they did, because at 11 o'clock that night, a group of SS soldiers attacked. They opened up with machine gun fire and began hitting the top of the castle wall. The defenders inside began to fire back. It was too dark to see anyone, and the entire battle was determined by tracer fire going back and forth in both directions. Slow gunfire continued all night long, with just enough contact being sustained to keep either side from pushing their luck. That was until dawn struck and people could actually see what they were shooting at. As soon as the SS could see, they began to fire an 88mm that they had stashed in the hillside the night prior. The first hit ripped through the castle wall, destroying a bunch of the rooms inside, before the 88 turned its attention on Lee's tank. The shot ripped through the tank, nearly killing the radio operator who was inside, and he just managed to get out before the fuel tank ignited and the tank blew up. So, while still blocking the main entryway, the tank was no longer usable. So because of that, the SS began to make their way to the east and west walls of the castle and tried to breach entry. As the gunfire began to heat up, Lee ordered the French prisoners back into the castle walls to protect themselves. However, they refused to leave and joined in on the fight. The SS soldiers on the ground began to throw grappling hooks up on the wall to try to climb over the castle wall that way, and the defenders on the walls would shoot down at them whenever they tried to climb. This went on for several hours, and I just want you to picture the image of Americans, Germans, and French all fighting together inside of the castle against other advancing Germans. Several of their French made their way to the top of the castle and began using the bolt-action rifles to pick off soldiers up in the tree line. Lee and Gongle went to the top of the castle wall and began to scope out machine gun positions. They were also trying to locate the 88mm, which had been very well hidden. A few of the defenders had been hit, although it wasn't enough on its own to risk defeat. And while I'm not exactly sure how it happened, some reports say that as he was trying to help one of the French prisoners inside of the castle, or while he was looking for the 88mm, Major Gongle was killed by sniper fire. The defenders continued to hold strong, however they were running out of ammunition and wouldn't be able to last for long. Now you may be thinking at this time, where is Andre at? Because that guy has spent like a day just hiding in the trees. Well, around this time at about noon on May the 5th, Andre and his group, led by Major John Kramers, had reached the village of Virgil and the bridge that Bass's tank was guarding. Kramers couldn't get into contact with Lee because, as mentioned, the radio in the tank was destroyed when, the tank blew up. So Kramers was trying to find a way to get in contact with Lee up at the castle to see how bad the situation was. And one of the Austrians said, "Have you tried calling him?" Because there was a phone line ran from the Virgil town hall to the castle. So Kramers calls the castle, and then in the middle of the shootout, one of the French pick up the phone And then I assume by yelling, "It's for you," to Lee, Lee comes to the phone and begins to describe the situation to Kramers. Like, you're in a gunfight in a derelict castle and the phone starts ringing and someone's like, "Oh, I better get that." So Lee explains, "I need help, like now." And Kramers and his group begins to rush their way up to the castle. At this point, the defenders didn't have a lot of time left. The SS kept getting closer in the tree line. And apparently the road to get to the castle was very confusing. There was a ton of different turns through the village and different ways to drive through the forest. So Jean Borotra, the Olympic tennis athlete that I mentioned earlier, who was familiar with the village, asked Lee if he could make a run for it to guide the tanks up the hillside. Lee tells him to do it, with the understanding that he may die. And as soon as a lull in gunfire hits, Jean vaults over the castle wall and then runs through the woods by several emplacements of SS soldiers and lives. I have absolutely no idea how that guy didn't die. For further comedic effect, you could do what I do and imagine him in like an Adidas tracksuit. So this guy sprints several miles down the hillside, finds the tank crew, and begins guiding them up the road to the castle. Meanwhile, in the castle, Lee is preparing for the worst case scenario, and as people are running out of ammo, he's ordering them to go into the castle and wait with knives. And when asked about it later, he said his plan was, if they ran out of ammo, they were each going to either get knives or just be ready to fight with their fist in like strategically placed positions throughout the castle's keep. Because, hey, I mean, that's what they were designed for in the first place, right? So might as well get medieval. So at around 3 p.m., almost everyone's out of ammo, and there's a bunch of very scared French and Germans inside of the castle ready to punch someone to death. The SS had made their way to the front gate and were about to storm into the courtyard of the castle itself, when they were stopped by machine gun and tank fire from the now arriving American tanks. Kramer's group had just made it up the hill and began shooting at the SS that were making their way to the front, and whenever they began to fire, the SS retreated. One of the few remaining Wehrmacht soldiers, who was still stationed at the top of the castle, began to scream in joy, "Amerikanische Panzer," which is German for American tank, which it's so wild. Again, I know I keep emphasizing the weirdness of the situation, but how can I not? A German soldier yelling American tank as if it's a good thing, when throughout the rest of the war it was a very bad thing.
Shop Michael's Great Big Holiday Sale to save on everything you need to make the season magical. Hurry, sale ends December 6th.
One of the reasons that the small details of this event are remembered so well is because in Kramer's group was a journalist who immediately began interviewing everyone and getting their take on what happened. And the journalist talked about the bizarre nature of coming into a medieval castle and seeing French, German, white, and black Americans all gathered together behind a burning tank shooting at other Germans. So as everyone was cheering and happy, Lee walked out of the castle with a blank expression and walked up to the officers who were standing next to Lee's burning tank. And without saying anything else, he just looked them in the eye and said, "So, what kept ya?" And then they all broke out into laughter over the humor of almost dying. So there at the castle, the wounded were treated, and the French, who had been there for far too long at this point, were immediately evacuated away. Everyone was given awards. I imagine the Wehrmacht were treated a little bit better than the other Wehrmacht after the surrender. Lee was given a Distinguished Service Cross medal, a Silver Star, and even promoted to captain. Now, the only official death that took place on the defender's side was that of Major Gongol. Most reports list that he was the only one dead, and there was like 4 or 5 wounded. But I think what it actually was is that the Wehrmacht soldiers who were fighting alongside the Americans and French, there was no official record of them, at least on any capacity in the Ally side. So I think they just don't exist historically. but I think some of them did die, because in a lot of the reports there's mentions of them clearing the bodies, as in bodies plural, not just Gongle. So whenever you read about this story and it's like, yeah, there was one dead and a few more injured, I think that's one person who history cares about dead, and then some defected Germans who no one really kept track of. But either way, it seems that there were no casualties on the French or American factions. And again, the only official death on the defenders' part recorded that day was that of Major Gongle, and an unspecified number of SS troops who were killed on the offensive side. According to Stephen Harding, decades later, shortly before Lee passed away, he was asked about the Battle of Castle Itter and what he thought of it. And after thinking about the question, Lee sat there in silence for a while and then said, well, it was just the damnedest thing. And that is the story of one of the most underrated battles in the entirety of American warfare. And I, for one, am personally offended that it's not only talked about more, but also, why isn't there like a movie about this thing? They will make a movie out of every 2-sentence paragraph in history that's like, this group of people defended this location. But here's a story of like the weirdest team up ever defending a medieval castle in a gunfight that lasted for over 12 hours. You've got Olympic athletes vaulting over hillsides and running through German lines, and you've got these German snipers shooting at German majors, and then these French prisoners. Like, you can do so much with this. I am bothered. I will be having my people, in other words, me and Kayla, in contact with Quentin Tarantino's legal team tonight if I have to. This is a fantastic story, and I think it's one that deserves to be told, which is why I wanted to tell it. And hopefully, if you stuck around this long, you think it's interesting as well, and that's cool, because I do too, and I just want to say thank you for watching. I didn't know about this story until recently. I was doing research for, again, the Mega Ultra World War II video I keep hyping up that I'm inevitably going to overhype. And I was looking at stories of like defectors and spies, and there was like a parenthesis at the end of a sentence that said something to the effect of, this is in contrast to when the Germans and Americans fought side by side at the Battle of Castle Itter. And I was just like, the what? Like, I found this off a rabbit hole. It reminds me of the Akali Raft video I did about, I called it like the not safe for work raft or whatever. Like that whole story, that came to me whenever I was researching like disturbing human experiments. And then that was one of them, and a parenthesis said, although the authority of this story has been debated. Like, I find out about the weirdest topics through footnotes. And I love it. I love doing this. I love this job. Love that I can envelop myself in research and then just chase these rabbit trails that become videos. And you guys are so fantastic for allowing me that, and it means a lot. We're at 1.67. Yeah, I think that's not a real number. You guys are great. I love you all to death. Thank you for that. Oh, 1.67 million subscribers, I should clarify. Thank you all so much for that. You mean the world. Thank you for getting me to this point. If you can't tell, I'm coming off of some kind of flu, sickness, something, and my voice is a little sparse, so I'm going to cut this outro short because it hurts a lot. But thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please check out, again, it'll be linked in the description, the Shadow of the Zone film. I'm very proud of the work we've already done for it. Hopefully the work we'll continue to do for it. So be on the lookout for that. Hopefully a live stream happening soon. That
At Chewy, you can save on all the gifts you need for the gifts that keep on giving. Because while they have no idea...
Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk about one of the most insane cases in American criminal history, the North Hollywood Shootout. The North Hollywood Shootout took place in the early hours of February the 28th, 1997 in Los Angeles, California. In less than an hour, what was supposed to be a simple bank robbery became one of the largest gunfights in law enforcement history. One of the most interesting details of the entire case is that nearly the entire shootout was caught on camera, meaning that now we can go back, watch the entire thing play out for ourselves, and decide exactly what went wrong. And we're going to do just that today. We're going to look at the criminals themselves, everything that led up to and happened immediately after the shootout, and piece by piece break down the events of that eventful day. And if you're not familiar with the events of that day, I cannot stress to you how much this looks like something out of an action movie, and I mean that in the best and worst way. So if that sounds interesting to you, stick around as we break down one of the most remarkable cases of a heist gone wrong. But before you hear me go on another unhinged rant, let's make sure you're hearing it the right way with today's sponsor, Raycon earbuds. With the best audio quality and the best package available, it's no mystery why Raycon earbuds has over 48,000 5-star reviews. With the noise isolating design, a lot easier to understand. I'm going to link the website in the description, so if any of this interests you, go check them out, donate if you feel like it. I certainly did, because I know how hard this research can be, and I'm really blown away with the effort. And also, I'm going to be my normal joking self through this thing, and if at any point you feel I'm being disrespectful of the victims or lives lost that day, just wait to see how this all played out. Our subject of this story is a bank robbery in Los Angeles, which isn't anything outstanding in itself. From the 70s to the 90s, bank robberies were all the rage. To give you an idea, in 1991, across the entire United States, there were 9,388 bank robberies, or in other words, a bank robbery every 16 minutes. Nationally, there was over $60 million lost every year to robberies, and that's with an average takeaway of about $6,000. Because, you know, the vast majority of bank robberies are guys running in with a gun, taking a couple hundred from the teller, and then trying to leave. Probably running into the glass door on their way out too. But every now and then someone would score it big, which is what would drive the numbers up. And not only were the large cash amounts enticing to would-be robbers, in the 80s the police said that they were catching about 25% of bank robbers. So statistically, you could walk into a building full of money with a gun and be pretty okay. In the early 90s, the government tried to curb this by de-incentivizing bank robberies. Transportation and storage of money became more secure, guards were more common at bank locations, and on the legal side of it, charges went from a few years jail time to up to 25 years in prison for armed robbery. And as things like forensics developed, that 25% number jumped up to around 53. Part of the reason they cracked down so hard on it was because in high population areas like LA, bank robberies had become a weird kind of pyramid scheme. Around 89, there was this epidemic where these gang leaders would get like crack addicts and homeless people off the side of the road and then give them a gun and then have them walk into a bank and rob the place with a note that was also written for them by the guy who, you know, gave them the gun. So they just walk up to the teller, hand the note, teller would hand the money, and they'd walk away like it was a McDonald's. So if, you know, bank robberies are so easy, you don't even have to be at the bank to rob it, someone should probably do something. In 1992, one gang called the Rolling 60s claimed 363 bank robberies in that year alone. Or in other words, one gang was robbing a bank a day with 2 vacation days. LA was so bad that in 1991, remember that 9,388 figure I gave earlier? Well, 1 in 4 of those was in LA. Think about that. You have this data for the entire United States, and if you remove one city, it drops by 25%. It was so bad that in LA in 1992, there was a robbery every 42 minutes. Why would you work at a bank? I'll get off this tangent in just a minute, but I decided real quick, like, how many banks are there in LA? And the first thing I got linked to was bank robberies, because of course I did. And this site is telling me that between 85 and 95, there were 3,500 banks in the region that were robbed 17,106 times. Meaning that if you worked at a bank in LA for those 10 years, statistically you were robbed at gunpoint 5 times. At what point do you just, like, not use money anymore? Bro, one day in 1992, there were 28 bank robberies in one day. Oh my word. So, suffice to say, it was bad. Hence, all of the crackdowns on bank robberies that I mentioned a moment ago. Now, this had 2 effects. One, yes, it did lower the overall number of robberies because people who thought it would be a quick cash grab weren't ready to deal with the security, the lower takeaways, and perhaps most importantly, the long jail sentences. But the second effect that it had is that now, whenever someone came to rob a bank, they came to rob a bank. Gone were the days of sort of small-scale mugging where any Joe could just walk into the bank with a pistol and then the teller would just throw giant white bags with dollar signs on them across the counter. That's how banks work, right? Now, a new type of robbery became more common, called a takeover. A takeover is the kind of thing you're familiar with in the movies, where the people walk into the bank and very loudly assert their dominance by shooting bullets into the air and telling everyone to get down. Because now getting the money was a much more involved process, as was getting through things like security guards and increased police presence. In order to be successful, you had to show your teeth and do it fast. Which leads us to today's suspects, Larry Phillips Jr. and Emilian Matasareanu. Larry Phillips Jr. was born under the alias of Larry Warfel. He was born under an alias because his parents were wanted by the law. At only 19 years old, Larry's father, Larry Phillips Sr., was arrested for grave robbing because he was trying to remove somebody's head because he thought it was funny. And then after that, he committed several robberies for which he was eventually arrested and then escaped, to which he was now on the run. So, Junior had a great role model growing up. Other stories claim that his mother was a criminal as well. However, at the very least, she was okay with her husband's doings. His dad was finally caught and arrested the day after Junior's 6th birthday. And throughout his upbringing, Larry had a hatred for law enforcement and authority. Emil's childhood wasn't as catastrophic, however, it certainly wasn't ideal either. Emil was born in Romania, and at the age of 10, he immigrated to the United States with his parents. He was the new kid at school, which caused him to be rather withdrawn and quiet. While all the reports indicate that he had a healthy and wealthy life at home with his parents, he wasn't doing well socially. One neighbor stated in an interview that whenever Emil graduated high school, he threw a party and no one showed up. Also know, just because I said that, someone's going to be like, oh, poor sad boy bank robber shootout man. His mother said the one hobby that her son ever really had was firearms, which, I think in and of itself is fine, but, the other thing he did, which was sitting on the front steps of his house and disassemble and reassemble his guns every day while staring at neighborhood children, maybe not okay. Regardless of these shortcomings, Emil became an electrical engineer and even started his own business. Keep that business in mind. It's going to come around in the end. You won't see it coming. It'll be great. Don't worry. Most stories say that Larry and Emil met each other in 1989 at a Gold's Gym at Venice Beach. Some other stories indicate that they knew each other beforehand, but 1989 is as early on the timeline that can be confirmed. You wouldn't think the two would get along, but after they figured out that they had a shared interest in firearms and eventually crime, they were a match made in not heaven. Now, it can't really be confirmed what was happening in the next several years following their meet. It seems that Emil was running his business for some time, and Larry was running his own business that we'll talk about. But for reasons I'll talk about later, I believe they were doing small-scale crimes during this time, and were slowly working their way up to what they would become. That side hustle of Larry's was real estate scams. He became a real estate agent and started doing all of these backdoor schemes in order to steal money from clients. He also shoplifted a $400 suit for funsies, I guess. So before his first big arrest, he had already stacked up a history of white-collar crime. There are several other crimes, because remember, LA was getting robbed a lot, that are believed to have been perpetrated by the two men, although it can't be confirmed. Unofficially, they are associated with 2 armored car robberies and 3 bank robberies. I mean, it's, not hard to see why. If all these were really them, then their first official hit was on an armored car on July the 20th of 1993. That incident went off mostly without a hitch. That was until October the 29th of that same year. The two of them were pulled over for speeding, and whenever the officer walked up to the window and began asking them basic questions, like where's your driver's license and insurance, they started to get nervous. Or at the very least, Emil did. See, at this point, they were using so many fake IDs and names for when it came to vehicles they were renting or properties that Larry was trying to scam someone on and false business practices, that it was pretty easy to get their stories mixed up, which it seems Emil did. When they were asked, is this your car, they were supposed to say that they had rented it from the airport because the car was rented from the airport. Instead, Emil panicked and said it's Dennis's mom's. Dennis was the alias that Larry was using at the time. So the cop was suspicious, he ran numbers on the car and saw that the story doesn't make sense, so he eventually arrested them and searched the car. In the rental car, they found 2 rifles, 2 handguns, 3,000 rounds of ammunition, police radio scanners, smoke bombs, IEDs, body armor, and 3 fake license plates. I almost have to give them credit for having the gall to drive around downtown LA in a rented vehicle with a small armory in the trunk. The 2 were charged with conspiracy to commit robbery. Duh, because after they ran their names and prints, they saw they were using fake aliases and had a record, and I'm sure those IEDs weren't medicinal. They were each given short jail sentences and 3 years probation. The most important part of this is that they were each given felony charges and had all their guns confiscated. Over the next few years, again, this is assuming that they did rob all of the places it's assumed that they robbed, they would hit another armored car in June of 1995, this time killing one of the guards aboard the armored car, and then torching the vehicle that they had drove in order to get rid of evidence. I guess they like heat. And then in 96, robbed 2 Bank of America locations. If they did do these hits, then they had stolen at this point about $1.5 million. The pair, only known for their ski mask and AKs, were dubbed the High Incident Bandits. There we go with the cool names again. At this point, again assuming the previous robberies were them, they got this method down to a science. They would go in loud, shooting rounds into the ceiling in order to freak everybody out. One of them would get the crowd to lay down and not look at their faces, so there was no risk of them being identified, while the other would go to the back door, shoot the door open to the teller's area, and have the bank manager take them to the vault where they would load cash into bags and then leave. Several of these heists took place in under 3 minutes, and given that the average police response time in the area was 8 minutes, the business was doing pretty good. However, as we're going to find out, for each of these heists, they brought an absurd amount of ammunition with them just in case something went down. They had planned for their next hit to be at another Bank of America location, this time the one at 6600 Laurel Canyon Boulevard. This was the largest Bank of America location in North Hollywood, so they assumed it would have the largest takeaway. This location had a parking lot to the north and south with a neighborhood bordering it on the east and a shopping mall bordering it to the west. While this did mean there was a higher chance to be seen as it was a high traffic area, it also meant that there were several escape routes. And in order to maintain fire superiority, the pair would bring with them 3 Norinco Type 56 rifles, or in other words, Chinese AK-47s, a Bushmaster XM15 dissipator, which is essentially a Sporter M16 with a shortened barrel, an HK-91 or civilian G3, and a Beretta 92 FS. The guns will come into more detail as things start to go wrong, trust me. The pair also heavily laid up in body armor, each wearing bulletproof material for a soft vest before inserting metal trauma plates underneath those vests. Phillips went a step farther by wearing what's called a groin guard, or essentially a bulletproof diaper, as well as taking pieces of Kevlar and duct taping it to his arms and legs. All of the weapons that they brought were not only illegally obtained, because if you'll remember they were both felons, but they were also illegally modified, save for the Beretta and the HK-91. If anything were to go down, the men would essentially become walking juggernauts, and as we're going to see, that's exactly what happened. Each of the Each of the men wore gloves in order to hide their fingerprints, so the gloves had sewn-in watch faces so that they could time the robbery itself. So, on February the 28th of 1997, the two men pulled into the north parking lot at 9:16 a.m. To calm their nerves, the two downed phenobarbital before they walked in. Phenobarbital is typically an anti-seizure medication, but for what they were using it for, it was a very intense nerve suppressor. The two set their timers for 8 minutes and then exited the 1987 Chevy Celebrity. Completely kitted out, the two made their way to the sidewalk and then began to walk into the Bank of America. And that 8-minute timer probably would have been okay if it wasn't for a patrol car that just so happened to be driving by at the same time. The patrol car saw the two guys in ski mask, bulletproof armor with rifles walking into the building and figured it was a problem. Walking into the front door, there was a man using the ATM who Larry grabbed, threw on the floor, yelled, "This is a holdup," and began shooting into the ceiling. Larry kept shooting and telling everyone to get down, while Emil ran to the teller door, shot the lock off, and then grabbed the assistant manager. As soon as the two had walked in, the teller hit the panic button, although that didn't really matter because again the patrol car already saw them, and Emil made his way with the assistant manager to the vault to start loading the bags with money. Now, as mentioned earlier, a lot of these robberies only took a couple minutes. However, due to the recent string of robberies, a couple probably committed by Larry and Emil, the banks had changed procedure. So now, instead of just opening one key and all the money was there for the taking, money was composed into these small individual lockboxes. Because of that, it took way longer to load the bags with money than it had previously. On top of that, the pair had planned to hit the bank this Friday morning because there was supposed to be a money delivery a few hours earlier. However, again, because of the string of bank robberies, deliveries were purposefully sporadic. So Emil kept yelling at the assistant manager to give him the rest of the money because he thought there was more even though there wasn't none, and what there was took longer to get a hold of. This would cause the two to eat up the entirety of their 8 minutes. Larry was again out in the lobby on crowd control. However, for some reason, 3 minutes after this all began, he walked outside to the front door of the bank. To me, this indicates that he probably saw the patrol car see them as they were walking inside, because I don't know why else he would do this. He walks out the front doors and then just standing there, ski mask and AK to his side, looks down the street one direction and down the street to the other direction and then just walks back in. It's believed that whenever he looked south, he could probably see the cop car, which was the initial cop car that called for backup. So what probably happened, in my opinion, is he saw the cop car and then thought this is probably going to be bad. So then he's on crowd control, he gets everyone to lay down. He then walks back outside to check, sees the cop car and thinks, yeah, it's going to get bad. After he comes back inside, he goes to the security guard who is laying on the ground with everyone else before putting a gun to the back of his head and saying, "Whenever I tell you to, move everyone into the vault." Larry then says something to Emil, most likely informing him that there's police outside and it's about to be a fight. So Emil zips up the bag he's been filling, which contains $303,305, as well as 3 dye packs. Dye packs, for those that don't know, are these little packets of dye that are made to explode if something's stolen or taken away, so that it becomes unusable and traceable for whoever stole it. I'm sure Emil wasn't aware of this, and after a short discussion with Phillips, they changed their game. While all of this is happening inside, on the outside, police are taking up defensive positions around the front door of the bank. I also want to mention really quickly, I looked at so many different interviews and